Jai Baba. Everyone and everything is everyone and everything at the same time and for all time. Meher Baba. Avatar Meher Baba ki Jai. Thanks to beloved Baba and Jai Baba to all of you. We are reading God Speaks. Baba's wish that each of his lovers read God Speaks at least once in their lifetime. So our purpose here is to read God Speaks. And if we are able to understand a bit of it, then that's like a bonus. Right now we are on page 10, and this is the 6th session of God Speaks.
At this stage, it suffices to mention here, for the limited human understanding, that the most finite first consciousness of the soul, while experiencing the most gross first impression, created itself, centered itself in an appropriate most finite and most gross medium, imperceptibly tending the soul without form to associate and identify its very infinite eternal self with this most gross and most finite limited form as its first medium.
Last session we said that we will hear a lot of this most first, most finite, most next, and all that. So we need to follow through that and not be confused about it.
So
last time,
emphasize.
yeah, that is the purpose is to emphasize its mostness. Last session we did about how creation came into being. We talked about the urge, we talked about the shrug, and we realized that that created an impression or a samskar. Then Baba goes on to say that an impression just cannot go away. The impression will need expression in order to experience. And in order for the impression to experience anything, it requires an appropriate medium. If the consciousness and the impression is most finite, then the appropriate medium will obviously be most gross. And as the consciousness of the soul evolves or accumulates more and more impressions, it will require more and more complex medium or form to experience those impressions. So coming back to the reading, at this stage, Baba says, it suffices to mention here for the limited human understanding. Baba knows that the human understanding is limited. Baba is talking about something which is beyond the mind, and therefore Baba says that there will be areas where we will not be able to understand. In other words, it would be ununderstandable, and we just will pass over or gloss over that. So Baba says, at one time Baba said, in order to appease the intellectual convulsions of man, he has given all these words. At other times Baba would say that it's a great headache for me to explain to you all about this because it is all beyond the mind. Mind, which is limited and finite, wants to understand that which is unlimited and infinite. Baba says that is impossibility. In order for the mind to understand that which is beyond mind, mind has to go. There should be no vestige of mind. In other words, Baba talks about manonash, mannonash, annihilation of the mind. Only when that takes place, we will be able to really not understand as understand through the mind, but experience experientially what Baba is talking about. So at this stage, it suffices to mention here, for the limited human understanding, that the most most finite first consciousness of the soul while experiencing the most gross first impression centered itself in an appropriate most finite and most gross medium, imperceptibly that which cannot be perceived without perception, undetectable. How it happened, we do not know. Imperceptibly, tending the soul. Tending means there's a tendency, there is a habit pattern. It automatically and spontaneously happen like that. There's a tendency following. So Baba says, tending the soul without form, because soul is always without form, to associate and identify its very infinite, eternal self, because the soul in its originality is infinite and eternal and without form. So tending the soul without form to associate and identify its very infinite, eternal self with this most gross and most finite, limited form as its first medium. As the impression is, so is the form. When the impressions gather more and more, in other words, when the evolution takes place more and more, then there'll be different, more and more complex or higher forms.
The first consciousness of the indivisible soul, experiencing the first impression through the first medium, creates a tendency in the soul to associate and identify its eternal, infinite self with the first form, the most finite and most gross, the seed of contrity spontaneously sown by the reverberations of the first urge, imperceptibly germinated and manifested for the first time in the shape of duality. When it is made to associate and identify itself by its newly gained consciousness with the finite gross form or medium, the consciousness of the soul actually makes the infinite, eternal, indivisible soul without form experience that it is that finite gross form.
All right. So the first consciousness of the indivisible soul, we have seen that the soul is infinite, feels it is helpless. The soul which is all-knowing feel it is ignorant. The soul which is all bliss knows itself as having bondage and suffering. That is the contrariety. That is the duality which automatically started at the time. Sorry?
Gaseous form. It started from the gaseous form.
Yeah, but Baba here starts from the stone stage. Huh? Yeah, it does happen in the gaseous form also, but Baba later on says that for understanding's sake, let us start with the gross, with the stone form. So here, which was, as I'm trying to explain this paragraph only, which was as the seed of contrariety. Contrariety means opposing to something which is original. Spontaneously means arising impulsively, arising momentarily, self-generated, proceeding from natural feeling or native tendency without any external or conscious constraint. Automatically, spontaneously, it happened, spontaneously sown by the reverberation. When the reverberation took place, the calm, tranquil ocean had some movement. When the movement takes place, there is a high and a low. So that is the duality, that is where it starts from. So what Baba says, sown by the reverberation of the first urge, imperceptibly germinated. Germinated means to grow, germinated and manifested for the first time in the shape of duality. Now, in order to understand, we just take Baba's word for it, that there was a shake and automatically, spontaneously, without any reason, the duality started, and the soul, which is eternal, which is infinite, which is one, which is actually the oversoul, started experiencing itself as other than the oversoul, started identifying itself as a drop rather than the ocean because of the existence of a bubble, which is the bubble of the mind, which is bubble of illusion, which is bubble of ignorance, automatically. When it is made to associate and identify itself by its newly gained consciousness. This is the first gained consciousness, most finite. With the finite gross form or medium, the consciousness of the soul actually makes the infinite, eternal, indivisible soul without form experience that it is that finite gross form. In other words, when all these things happened, it automatically, in a sense, compulsorily made that drop which actually is in the ocean and which actually is the ocean identify itself as a drop. So this is how it started from the beginning.
Thus, the consciousness gained by the unconscious soul, instead of experiencing reality through unity and identity with the oversoul, experiences illusion through duality and identity with the gross form, multiplying diverse, innumerable impressions in a series of experiences while associating with the gross form and gradually gaining or evolving more and more consciousness.
Basically, we have covered this, that the consciousness gained by the unconscious soul or drop, instead of gaining the consciousness of I am the ocean, gained the consciousness of I am the drop, or I am a soul and not the oversoul. I am Atma and not the Paramatma. And this kept on, this is the starting point of the game called creation and evolution. So this now drop soul identifies itself as other than, separated from, different from the oversoul or the ocean.
In order to understand more clearly and concretely how the consciousness gained by the soul gradually develops through the process of evolution, let us examine that state of conscious soul where the consciousness of the soul associates itself with stone form as the most finite and most gross medium, and the soul thus begins to identify itself as stone.
Okay. So in other words,
bracket.
that's what I'm saying. In other words, Baba is saying that in order to understand now, let us start from the stone form. Although before the stone there is a gaseous form, of which Baba says it is just beyond our human ken or understanding as to how that association takes place. So Baba is now starting from the stone form.
Actually, the consciousness of the soul utilizes the stone form only after innumerable cycles and ages of diverse experiences through diverse innumerable species of forms, of which there are seven major different kinds of most finite and most gross gaseous forms, which cannot even be concretely grasped nor imagined by ordinary human beings.
So in passing, Baba is saying that this stone form or the consciousness associating with stone form comes after so many, here Baba is using the word innumerable cycles and ages of the consciousness of the soul first associating itself with the gaseous form and which human beings cannot even understand. So Baba says of which there are seven major different kinds of most finite and most gross gaseous form which cannot even be concretely grasped nor imagined by ordinary human beings. So we should not attempt even to understand what Baba is trying to convey.
It is therefore for our convenience that we begin with that state of conscious soul when it just begins to associate and identify itself with stone form.
So he's making it easy for us. Okay, maybe you could understand from stone form itself.
In stone form, too, there are innumerable varied species, and the consciousness of the soul has to utilize each and all of these species as appropriate media, one after the other, in accordance with the diversity of impressions of the soul, to experience varied and countless impressions gathered one after the other in stone form.
I don't think this requires any explanation. There are varied species of stone forms.
Marble.
Yeah, many.
Yeah, the example.
Marble, granite is all that we know of, but there are so many species must be. I'm sure when it takes ages and ages for a particular soul to go through all this thing, there must be so many innumerable, Baba says, varied species of stone form. So one after the other, the consciousness of the soul experiences all these forms.
If we take stone as a medium for most gross impressions, it follows that the soul, which is eternally in the oversoul Paramatma, now with most finite consciousness experiences most gross impressions through the medium of stone form.
Okay, here also again no need to explain, because as the impressions are, so are the experiences of these impressions through dawning or taking upon appropriate form or appropriate medium or appropriate body. So the first most finite is the stone form.
It is thus that the infinite, indivisible, eternal
See,
soul.
Baba keeps on repeating this in order to ground us to the understanding that it is thus that the infinite, eternal, indivisible soul without form has now, because of the duality and contrariety and all that, started assuming different forms, not only assuming different forms, but taking that form to be me. This is, I am stone, I am metal, I am mineral, I am this, I am that.
It is thus that the infinite,
Indivisible.
indivisible, eternal soul without form, which is eternally in the oversoul, while experiencing the most finite gross impressions through its own most finite consciousness, utilizes the most finite gross medium of the first most species of stone, first most meaning the very first. And the soul is thus imperceptibly, though spontaneously, made to identify itself as stone.
So we have almost covered this in our explanation, that although the soul is in the oversoul, it identifies itself as other than the oversoul, separated from the oversoul. Oversoul is infinite, I am finite, because of this particular spontaneously associating itself with the form.
After ages and cycles, the most finite gross consciousness is gradually much more evolved in the soul by innumerable and varied experiences of the most gross finite impressions through the identification of the soul with the first most species of stone. Eventually, when a limit to taking experiences is reached, the identification of the soul with the first most species of stone is gradually dissociated, and that stone form is dropped.
So here we need to be a little, the next paragraph we need to understand, because the mechanics, the methodology, the modus operandi of how it happens is a particular consciousness of the soul experiences certain, let's say, stone, various species of stone form. For ages and ages it experiences, and after all the experiences of the stone form have been experienced, the stone form is dropped. Now when the stone form is dropped, the consciousness already has certain impressions. The consciousness which, when in form, which means the stone form, was focusing, I am a stone. Now the stone is dropped, the stone form is dropped. Now the consciousness focuses on the impressions. I'll just try to explain. Now the focus of the consciousness without the form is on the impressions. Now the impressions cannot just remain impressions. It needs experience. So in other words, for impressions to express itself into experience, will search for another appropriate medium or form or body. So this is the theme all through the kingdoms, everything, it will be the same thing, that after experiencing all the experiences in a particular form, that form is dropped. Although that form is dropped, the impressions are contained in the consciousness of the soul. The impressions cannot remain without being expressed or experienced, and the focus of the consciousness which was in the form, while in form, now focuses on the impressions. And it takes or searches out another form where it would experience the impressions which it has gathered in the last stone form dropped. I don't know if I'm making sense. It's very, very, what should I say, rhythmic. It's very rhythmic. There's a music to it in a sense, that when we read more and more, you'll understand, oh, it's so simple. It's like that. Go ahead.
The soul remains now for a period without any medium.
There's no medium, there's no form, there's no body.
Though the most finite consciousness, which has been evolved, remains together with the most gross finite impressions of the most first species of stone form just shed.
In other words, what Baba is saying, the consciousness has evolved, it has no form. Although it has no form, it says that the consciousness which has been evolved remains together with the most gross finite impressions. Consciousness remains with the impressions, although there is no form, and now it is looking out for another form or body or medium by way to experience the impressions which it has gathered in the stone form which was just dropped.
Shed.
The second edition, but the sense of the matter is clear, that the consciousness which is now with impressions but without form has to look out for an appropriate form or a medium or a body in order to experience those impressions.
Therefore, in order to experience the impressions of the most first species of stone form dropped, the consciousness of the soul centered in the impressions of the dropped stone form begins to associate with the most next species of stone form. The soul identifies itself with this species of stone, and the consciousness of the soul begins to experience through association with the new medium of the most next species of stone form the impressions of the most first species of stone form.
In other words, while the consciousness was experiencing the most first species of the stone form, the consciousness was evolving. After it went through the entire process of evolution of the most first species of the stone form was dropped. Now it goes into the most next species of the stone form. Just be with me, it's very simple to understand. The most next species of the stone form is nothing but a consolidated mold of the impressions gathered in the most first species of the stone form. I'll repeat. In the most first species of the stone form, the consciousness evolved and gathered impressions. Impressions are there, consciousness is there, most first stone form is also there. After experiencing for ages and whatever, the most first species of the stone form drop. Right? So now what is left is consciousness and impressions. Impressions of what? Impressions which were gathered in the most first species of the stone form which it has just dropped. So impressions is there. Now it is going to experience the impressions gathered in the most first form of the stone when in the most next stone form. Most next stone form. In other words, the most next stone form is nothing but a consolidated mold of the impressions which were gathered in the most first form of stone.
The previous one.
The previous one. So that is how it goes. Once we understand this basic, how the whole thing works, it becomes very free-flowing. Once a particular form is dropped, the consciousness is focused or centered in the impressions. Impressions of what? Which were gathered in the dropped form. And those impressions now is looking out for the most next form or body or medium. And in other words, conversely, what it means is that the most next form is nothing but the consolidated mold of the impressions gathered in the most first stone form, which it has just dropped. I am repeating it again and again so that it sinks into us, and once it sinks, then we will sing very beautifully because it's very smooth flowing. Go ahead.
The most important point to be understood here is that when the consciousness of the soul dissociates its identification from one form or medium and retains only the impressions of the forms so dissociated, these impressions are experienced through another appropriate medium when the consciousness of the soul associates with the next medium or form.
Very clear. I'll repeat. I think it doesn't need any explanation.
But
No problem. The most important point to be understood here is that when the consciousness of the soul dissociates its identification from one form or medium and retains only the impressions of the form so dissociated, it is only retaining the impressions. These impressions are experienced through another appropriate medium when the consciousness of the soul associates with the next medium or form. One is dropped, the impressions are there. These impressions will now be experienced and expressed through another form, another medium, which is higher than the form or the medium which it has just dropped.
But this next medium or form is always created and molded of the consolidated impressions of the last species of form with which the soul associated and identified itself, and which impressions were retained by the consciousness of the soul even when dissociated from the form.
Correct.
Thus,
I'm repeating, this is just to uh, make us grounded in this beautiful, you can say, music of how the whole thing works. Baba says, but the next medium or form is always created and molded of the consolidated impressions of the last species of form with which the soul associated and identified itself, and which impressions were retained by the consciousness of the soul even when dissociated from the form. The form is dissociated, the form has gone, but the impressions have remained. Impressions and consciousness go hand in hand. And now the impressions can't remain without experiencing. So in order to experience those impressions, another form is taken. So in other words, what Baba says, that the next form is nothing but a consolidated mold of the impressions which the form had gathered, the earlier form had gathered, and which it has now just dropped.
thus, innumerable diverse experiences of countless impressions experienced by the consciousness of the soul through diverse and innumerable species of stone forms, one after the other, lead to the greater evolution of consciousness of the soul.
Evolution means gathering more and more impressions. After the impressions are gathered, the form is dropped, another form is taken. In another form, these impressions are experienced. In the experiencing of the impressions in the next form, you are again accumulating fresh impressions. Again, that form is dropped, and you have got a consolidated mold of impression. And that is how the whole chain of events keep on gathering. In the process, the consciousness of the soul is evolving or growing or getting more and more experiences. And once this happens, with entire stone form is over, then it jumps into the second form. Go ahead.
Ultimately, a stage is reached after cycles, ages and cycles of experiences where the consciousness of the soul has a tendency to dissociate the soul even from the most last species of stone form, and although the most last species of stone form is dissociated or dropped by the soul, the most finite consciousness evolved thus far remains together with the most finite gross impressions of the most last species of stone form dropped.
Okay, I'll repeat this again. Ultimately, it is experience all the experiences which are required in the stone form. Now it has to jump into another, which is metal, stone. At certain places, there's a clubbing of stones, metal, minerals and all that. But we'll go by what God speaks says. Ultimately, a stage is reached after ages and cycles of experiences where the consciousness of the soul has a tendency to dissociate the soul even from the most last species. Now from the most first, the most finite, the most gross, now we have come to the most last species of the stone form. And although the most last species of stone form is dissociated or dropped by the soul, the most finite consciousness evolved thus far remains together with the most finite gross impressions of the most last species of the stone form dropped. In other words, the most last species, I hope I'm not complicating more, I'm trying, the most last species of the stone form was the consolidated mold, was made out of the consolidated mold of the most last but one species of the stone form. Barabar? So this is the most last. Now even when the most last species of the stone form is dropped, the impressions which were gathered in the most last species of the stone form remain centered in the consciousness. Now there is consciousness and there is impression. There is no
Form.
there is no most last species of the stone form because it is dropped. Now it jumps to the metal form. So in other words, those impressions which were gathered in the most last species of the stone form, now they are itching, they are urging, I want to experience these impressions. And it can only do it because the stone form is over, the most last stone form is over. It can only do it through the most first species of the metal form. I hope I am making clear. Now the most first species of the metal form is nothing but a consolidated mold of the most last species of the stone form just dropped. Clear? So simple. All right, go ahead, Soumya.
The soul, now without any medium or form, is conscious of the most finite gross impressions, sanskaras, of the most last species of stone form.
That was dropped, but impression is there, samskaras is there. It is conscious about that. Okay,
The soul must necessarily experience these impressions.
correct.
Now, in order to experience the impressions of the most last stone form, the soul associates and identifies with another medium, the metal form.
Metal form.
This medium of metal form is but the mold of the impressions of the most last species of stone form.
Very simple. This is the material from which something else is built. Now this form is dropped, but when the form is dropped, there is some impression. These impressions will now make another form, like that.
In other words, the most first species of metal form is created and molded of the most last species
of the
stone form impressions.
which it has already dropped, which is just dropped. Correct.
It is thus that the infinite, eternal...
Again, Baba is repeating, it is thus that the infinite, eternal soul, without form, So just grounding us more and more into this. Go ahead.
It is thus that the infinite, eternal soul, without form, which is eternally in the
In the
oversoul,
oversoul.
experiences through evolved consciousness the most gross, finite impressions of the most last species of stone form, while associating and identifying itself with the most first species of metal form.
That means the soul, which is eternal, which is infinite, which is without any form, which is in the oversoul, is now experiencing the most last impressions of the stone form dropped through the medium of the most first metal form. Clear?
There are diverse and innumerable species of metal form just as there are in stone form, and the consciousness of the stone utilizes these diverse, innumerable species of metal form as media through which to experience the diverse and innumerable impressions gathered.
Just as how the soul, consciousness of the soul, experience innumerable and diverse experiences in different stone species, now it is experiencing the same thing in the metal form and gaining more and more consciousness.
Thus, the evolution of the consciousness of the soul gains and gathers momentum in proportion to the diverse and multiple experiences of varied and innumerable impressions through countless different media or species of forms. This is how the cycles of evolution of consciousness of the soul go on evolving further and greater consciousness with evolution of forms of higher and higher species while experiencing or exhausting the impressions of the dissociated forms of the lower and lower species.
So this is how this merry-go-round keeps happening. We experience higher and higher evolution, higher and higher experiences of higher and higher species through more and more complex, I would use the word complex, association with complex medium or form or bodies. So this is how it goes on. I'll repeat this. It's very simple. This is how the cycle of evolution of consciousness of the soul go on evolving further and greater consciousness with evolution of forms of higher and higher species while experiencing and exhausting the impressions of the dissociated forms of the lower and lower species. Because as you go higher, you are actually experiencing the impressions of the lower species, and then you drop that and move on, and drop that and move on. That is how the whole mechanics work.
The consciousness of the soul experiences and exhausts all the impressions of the most last species of stone form through the medium of the most first species of metal form.
That means what was the most first species of the metal form? It was made out of the consolidated mold of the most last species of the stone form. Now, when all the experiences of the most last species of the stone form are experienced and exhausted in the most first species of the metal form, then that metal form is dropped. Clear?
When all the impressions of the most last species of stone form are exhausted, the consciousness of the soul dissociates itself from the most first species of metal form and drops that form. But the consciousness now retains the impressions of the most first species of the metal form.
There is an asterisk. Is there an asterisk with you? Okay. So very simple. I tend to repeat because that way it becomes a little easy. The most first species of the metal form. Made up of what? Made up of the impressions of the most last species of the stone form. Simple. Now when all the impressions of the most first species of the stone form are experienced and exhausted in the most first species of the metal form, then that metal form is dropped. But in the process of experiencing the impressions of the most last species of the stone form in the most first species of the metal form, it also gathered and accumulated more impressions. The earlier impressions are over, metal form dropped. But what about the impressions which are now gathered? They are now centered in the consciousness without a form. The form is gone. Consciousness is there, the impressions are there, and now it is looking out for the most next species of the metal form to experience and exhaust the impressions which have been gathered in the most first species of the metal form. Clear? Okay, go ahead.
These impressions of the most first species of the metal form are now experienced by the conscious soul through its association and identification with the most next species of metal form. This form is but the consolidated mold of the impressions of the most first species of metal form which was dropped or dissociated by the conscious soul.
Sorry, there was an asterisk there. I just want to read that.
Please.
the reader should not think the oft appearing most, such as most first, most next, most finite, are superfluous or redundant. You should not feel like that because each species of a certain form, stone for instance, has numerous repetitions with slight variations before going on to the most next species of that same form. And it seemed necessary to differentiate most last. To differentiate. Most last is used to mean the form most recently encountered, that is, the highest and the latest evolutionary form of the species, and should not be construed as the form furthest down the scale. These are the remarks of the editor. Editor is saying that don't think that they are redundant, don't think that they are just unnecessarily given. No, because there are so many variations that it requires to be emphasized the most firm and the most next and the most last and the after that the next. So the editor is saying that they are very important to understand. All right, go ahead.
A chain of varied, innumerable species of metal forms is thus
Created.
created,
And
and
the
the
soul.
soul, or to be more precise, the consciousness of the soul,
Very good that there is a bracket. Soul does not experience anything. Nothing ever happens to the soul. Unsketched, as they say. There is no such thing as, like, what should I say, high soul, low soul. Everything is happening to the consciousness of the soul. And therefore here, Baba is saying, a chain of a chain of varied species of metal forms is thus created, and the soul, and then bracket, or to be more precise, the consciousness of the soul associates with and dissociates from every species of the metal form.
exhausting and gaining diverse impressions.
So everything that is happening is only happening to the consciousness of the soul. Soul always remains one. Soul is always eternal. Soul is always infinite. Soul is everywhere. Soul is indivisible. All this drop soul business or Atma business is nothing but a Brahm. It's an illusion created through the creation of the mind or ignorance or illusion.
Yes, please.
Please.
This means that the soul is the part of God, or is the God
Soul is God.
is God. That's why
Bas-
the soul must experience and is in the form.
There is no difference. There is no difference between Atma and Paramatma. Atma is in fact Paramatma. Atma is the false apparent separation from the Paramatma because of the existence of ignorance. Once, sorry?
What?
The consciousness of the soul grows.
The consciousness keeps changing, the soul does not keep changing. Soul is soul. Infinite, eternal, everywhere, unlimited, indivisible. Nothing happens to the soul. But because my identity, my association is with the form, this body, I think I am different from you and you. I think like that. But in reality, Advait, when they say there is only one and that is God. It is God. God alone is real. All else that seems real is an illusion. God alone. And God alone is apparently experiencing himself in each one of us. Got it? So nothing happens to the soul. Soul is always eternal and infinite. At other time, Baba has said, that God realization is nothing, because we are all actually God. So God realization is nothing but the experiential knowledge, experience, capital K, knowledge, that I am God. It's just that. It's not something that is spirituality, something to be brought from outside, gathered, accumulated, studied, effort. No. Baba says that spirituality is not an accumulation or a gathering or something from outside. It is an unfoldment from within. God is already there. But God has been layered with a lot of garbage, a lot of samskaras, a lot of clutter, a lot of impressions, a lot of what I am not. So in the process of reincarnation, we are talking about, now we are talking about evolution, but in the process of reincarnation, what is required is just to cut off all that I am not. Neti neti, we say in Aarti, neti neti veda pukare. Neti neti means I am not this, I am not that. Baba had given a prayer to be said, to be recited to the monthly members. It says something like this: I am not the body, I am not the mind, I am not this, I am not that. I am nothing but a living lie of that truth. That is me. And unless the lie is dead, the truth cannot be. In other words, what is required is that somebody had asked Baba, what is the difference between finite and infinite and all that. Baba said, there's nothing finite. Finite is an illusion. Separation is an illusion. Division is an illusion. You see? So, we are all in illusion, not just now, but right from the stone or gaseous state where just we read, there has automatically, spontaneously, without any effort, we have created a tendency, a habit pattern to associate with the medium or form or body that we take and think and feel and believe and behave as if I am that body. This is me. So that has been going on. That is why Baba says, I have come not to teach but to awaken. Awaken what? In my understanding and interpretation, to awaken, to awaken himself in each one of us. The moment he is awakened within us, we are awakened. Aham Brahmasmi, Anal Haq, I am God state. Okay? All right, go ahead. If any of you have any questions, do ask.
Conscious is the mirror, no?
Sorry?
In God's inner consciousness is what Baba created consciousness for this. While experiencing these impressions, the soul evolves more and more consciousness simultaneously with the evolution of the higher and higher species of forms.
Simultaneously, consciousness evolves. I cannot experience those impressions in that form. I have to look out for a more bigger or a higher form. So that is how consciousness first precedes and then the form follows. Form is a byproduct of the factory of consciousness. Somewhere Baba says like this: first the consciousness and then the form follows.
After ages and cycles, at last, the consciousness of the soul associates and identifies itself with the most last species of metal form to experience the impressions of the most last but one species of the metal form that the soul has just dropped or dissociated.
We'll read this again so that these mechanics get into our head. After ages and ages, now the consciousness of the soul is experiencing the most last species of the metal form. And Baba is repeating. And what is the most last species of the metal form? It is nothing but a consolidated mold of the impressions of the most last but one species of the metal form dropped. The last but one before that, dropped. Now the impressions are there. What do? I take another form. What is that form? That form is the last species of the metal form. So now, after experiencing all the impressions of the last but one species of the metal form, in the last species of the metal form, now even that last species of the metal form is dropped. And now, for a time being, the consciousness is associated with the samskaras or impressions because it doesn't have the form, and then it jumps into the other form, which is the vegetables. So that is how it goes. Once we pay attention to these initial stages, it's like, algebra. You step by step, it will become very easy for us to follow.
This soul, eternally in the oversoul,
See, again repeating Baba.
though being infinite and without form, finds itself as metal.
Metal.
While identifying itself with diverse species of metal form, the soul begins to experience simultaneously the gross world in accordance with and in proportion to the soul's experiences of the stone form and the metal form. The metal form, which includes a series of diverse species of metal, is as inorganic, inanimate, and solid as the stone form, which includes a series of diverse species of stone.
Now, inorganic, the meaning that I had taken down is that does not originate in a living organism. It is inorganic. Inanimate means not alive, lacking the quality or ability of motion. Right? Go ahead.
The soul, or more precisely, the consciousness of the soul.
Again, Baba is repeating the soul, or more precisely, the consciousness of the soul.
While identifying itself with the species of stone and metal forms, finds itself as one with the stone or metal form and thus realizes itself as inorganic, inanimate, and solid, and experiences these inorganic, inanimate, and solid states throughout the entire evolution of the stone and metal forms in the gross world. The solid, inanimate state of the soul is one in which life and energy are still dormant.
Dormant means inactive. They are not manifest. They are there, but they are inactive. They are not manifest.
In spite of greater evolution of consciousness. Hence, the forms in this solid state cannot of their own accord move about by themselves. That is, they cannot have voluntary motion. And therefore, the consciousness of the soul, associating with these solid forms which are inanimate and inorganic, and with life and energy still dormant in them, tends to assert recumbent horizontal positions rather than to assert vertical upright stance or erect positions in the gross world.
So with regard to the stone and metal forms, Baba says that they are inorganic, they are solid, and they do not have life. What are
No
the words?
voluntary motion.
No voluntary motion comes later on, and no voluntary motion, and they are recumbent. They are in a lying posture, lying down. Stone, metals,
Horizontal.
minerals, they are, sorry?
Horizontal.
Horizontal, lying. They are not vertical in their position or posture. But life and energy is there, but they are dormant. They are not yet manifest.
After ages and cycles of varied, innumerable gross experiences of diverse and innumerable impressions through a variety of countless species of metal forms, the consciousness of the soul eventually dissociates itself even from the most last species of metal form.
So after experiencing all the metal forms, it is now, the consciousness is now dissociating itself with the last species of the metal form dropped.
Thus, the identity of the soul with the most last species of metal form is dropped, and as usual, the conscious soul now is once again temporarily unidentified with any form.
The moment any form is dropped, the consciousness is unidentified. It cannot identify itself with any form because that form has gone. We call it death. In human being, we call it death. So that form is gone. So the consciousness is now associated with the impressions temporarily for a short period of time till it obtains a new and a more complex form.
That is, the soul is now without any form.
Without any form, correct.
In the state of the conscious soul, when there is no form with which to be associated, the consciousness of the soul is centered only in the impressions of the most last species of metal form which has now been dropped.
In other words, When in form, the consciousness of the soul is focused on the form and is identified with the form and takes it to be that form, like how we are. We are having form. So as of now, the consciousness is focused on the form. I am this. The moment the body is dropped, the form is dropped, the consciousness of the soul for a short period, for a temporarily, cannot identify with the form because the form is dropped. So it is now associated with the impressions. I will repeat the last three lines. In this state of the conscious soul, when there is no form with which to be associated, the consciousness of the soul is centered only in the impressions of the most last species of metal form which has now been dropped. The consciousness remains with the impressions.
Thus, the conscious soul, in this state of having no form for identification, is conscious only of the impressions of the most last species of metal form. The conscious soul must exhaust these impressions of the most last species of metal form by the consciousness of the soul experiencing these impressions through some appropriate medium.
Again, I am repeating. The conscious soul must experience. Impressions cannot remain unexperienced. The conscious soul must experience these impressions, and in order to experience these impressions, which are of the most last species of the metal form just dropped, it has to look out for a more complex form or metal.
Appropriate.
Form or,
Appropriate medium.
appropriate media, right.
And the appropriate medium to spend or exhaust these impressions of the most last species of metal form is the most first species of vegetable form.
So vegetable form, now the entire form is changed from metal, now from the stone to metal, from metal to vegetables, yeah.
This species of vegetable form is nothing but the consolidated mold of the impressions of the most last species of the metal form.
Which is just dropped. Again, as I said, it's a repetition, cyclical it is. The most first species of the vegetable form is nothing but, or is made out of, or nothing but the consolidated mold of the most last species of the metal form just dropped.
When the consciousness of the soul associates now with the most first species of vegetable form, the soul, thus conscious, tends to identify itself with that form and actually finds itself as that species of vegetable form, quite oblivious of the reality that it, soul, is infinite, eternal, and without form, eternally in the Oversoul, Paramatma.
So it is oblivious, it doesn't know, the soul doesn't know that actually I am Paramatma. It associates itself with a vegetable form.
In the state of the most first species of the vegetable form, the consciousness of the soul experiences the gross world in accordance with and in proportion to the impressions it experienced and experiences of the stone forms, metal forms, and vegetable forms respectively. While thus experiencing the gross world, this consciousness of the soul, identified with the vegetable form, realizes now that it is vegetable and has half inanimate and half animate attributes.
So now gradually the consciousness is expanding or evolving. The stone and the metal were totally and utterly inanimate. Now the vegetable is seeing that it is half animate and half inanimate.
The conscious soul now asserts in the gross world through this vegetable form an upright, erect stand.
So now, which was recumbent, horizontal, now for the first time, the consciousness has a vertical stand. Trees are mostly vertical. with their roots, which is the head, down. So that's why we feed the tree in the roots. We give khane ka in the roots and not on the leaves, right?
Although this form cannot stand independently by itself, it uses the support of other media to assert an upright stand. This form is still not capable, however, of giving the experience of voluntary movement to the consciousness of the soul.
So the progress was from recumbent to upright, from utterly inanimate to partly animate and partly inanimate. But still, it cannot stand on its own. It requires the support of other mat, which is the soil. And another so-called drawback is that it does not have physical movement. Trees cannot move by itself. This locomotion or movement comes in the next jump, which is from the vegetable to the insects. So there you start walking. So gradually the evolution of consciousness is evolving and gathering more and more experiences. Go ahead.
Impressions. After the impressions of the last most species of metal form are exhausted by the consciousness of the soul through the most first species of vegetable form, this most first species of vegetable form is dropped. That is, the consciousness of the soul dissociates itself from this most first species of vegetable form.
Now again I am repeating so that it goes in properly. The most first species of the vegetable form is nothing but a consolidated mold of the most last species of the metal form which was dropped. Now these impressions of the metal form are to be experienced, which are being experienced in the most first species of the vegetable form. Now when all the impressions of the most last species of the metal form are experienced and exhausted in the most first species of the vegetable form, then that first vegetable form is dropped. And when it is dropped, it has already accumulated through the process of experiencing the impressions of the most last species of the metal form. The vegetable form also accumulated fresh impressions which are there. So now the consciousness and the fresh impressions of the most first species of the vegetable form are there. And now it will take what? The most next species of the vegetable form.
Again, the conscious soul realizes that it is without a form, although the evolved consciousness is there. This evolved consciousness of the soul is now centered in the impressions of the most first species of the vegetable form just dropped or dissociated.
So consciousness always remains associated with the impressions which have been accumulated and gathered in the form which is just dropped or dissociated with.
To experience these impressions of the most first species of vegetable form, the consciousness of the soul, now without any form, utilizes an appropriate medium, which is the most next species of the vegetable form.
Most next.
This most next species of the vegetable form is nothing but the consolidated mold of the impressions of the most first species of vegetable form.
Correct.
By association with the medium of the most next species of vegetable form, the consciousness of the soul experiences in the gross world the impressions of that last species of the vegetable form just dropped.
The most next vegetable form is experiencing the first impressions of the first impression of the vegetable form. It's always like that. What is being experienced now is what I have gathered in the last, in terms of body, incarnation. So in the same way, all the impressions which were gathered in the most first species of the vegetable form are now being experienced and exhausted in the most next species of the vegetable form. Simple.
When these impressions are exhausted through diverse experiences, the consciousness of the soul relinquishes its association with the most next species of vegetable form and again experiences that it, the soul, is without gross form and that its consciousness is centered only in the impressions of that species of form just dropped.
So the most next species of the vegetable form, after experiencing all the impressions of the most last species of the metal form, then that form is dropped. The vegetable form is dropped. The most next vegetable, I'm sorry, not the metal form, the first species of the vegetable form. Once that is dropped, now the consciousness of the soul without the form is focused on or centered on those impressions which were gathered by the most next vegetable form while it was there, and now the vegetable form is dropped.
The most first vegetable mate is experiencing, and that will be used by the next one, na?
Yeah, I said the same thing. Okay, let me repeat. The most next, that means not the first but the next.
Yeah.
The most next species of the vegetable form is nothing but a consolidated mold of the most first species of the vegetable form which was just dropped.
Yes.
Barabar? So now we are now stationed in the most next vegetable form, and I am experiencing as the most next vegetable form all the experiences of the most first vegetable form.
Correct.
After all the experiences of the most first vegetable form are experienced and exhausted, the most next species of the vegetable form is dropped. The consciousness of the soul, now without a form, because it has dropped, is focused on the impressions which were gathered by the most next species of the vegetable form when it was in form. Right? Correct. So then that is how it goes on. Correct.
Again, to experience these impressions, the consciousness of the soul tends the soul to identify with the next species of vegetable form. This chain of impressions, experiences, and species of form from one form to another is so linked that it is apparently endless. And the consciousness of the soul, in order to evolve itself fully and completely, has no other course but to become entangled in this vicious circle until, perforce, the consciousness of the soul thus gained makes the soul realize that it is infinite, eternal, and eternally in the oversoul, and makes the soul experience infinite power, knowledge, and bliss.
So Baba says that there is a tendency, that is what he has put, some magnetic tendency, that automatically we tend to take on more and more complex form. There is no way out but to evolve more and more consciousness till the evolution of consciousness is whole, complete, full in the first human form. In the first human form, it's complete. So, technically, in the first human form, we should have realized God and said, oh, Aham Brahmasmi, I am God state. But it doesn't happen because although the consciousness is fully developed, fully evolved, there is no further extension, expansion of consciousness. That consciousness is unable to experience the I am God state because of the existence of a mountain of samskaras or impressions, which we have gathered through this long travail of evolving consciousness. So now I'm jumping to the human form. In the human form, there is no evolution of consciousness. It's complete. Now there is only reincarnation, And in the reincarnation process, all that is required of the fully evolved, developed consciousness is to remove all that is not I am God state. In other words, the reincarnation process is only weeding away, removing, cutting off all the nonsense, all that I am not. So, but we are not coming to human being yet. We still have a long time to go. We are in the vegetable form.
The point that is important and which is to be carefully noted is that as the cycle of evolution of consciousness of the soul rolls on and evolves further and greater consciousness through experiences of further and greater impressions, this evolution of consciousness inadvertently evolves a series of forms of higher and higher species while exhausting the impressions of the lower and lower species that get dissociated or dropped or shed.
It inadvertently, not on purpose, not intentionally, automatically, the impressions are such that it wants expressions, it wants to experience. And in order for those impressions to experience those impressions, it is automatically gaining more and more complex form. One after the other, one after the other, the forms keep on evolving as the evolution of consciousness is proceeding.
Thus, the gap between the beginning and the end of a series of species of one particular form, such as stone form or metal form or vegetable form or other forms, beginning with the lowest or crude most first species of a form of particular kind and ending with the highest or sublime most last species of form of that particular kind, is progressively filled in by the evolution of forms of higher and higher types suitable to the impressions and aiding the consciousness of the soul to gain higher and higher consciousness.
So in this sentence, Baba is trying to say that when you enter into a certain form, first, it is the crudest form, not refined, not noble, not higher. And then gradually, between the first and the last of those species, we gradually modify ourselves, we gradually become more refined. So here Baba says, begins with the lowest or crudest, most first species of a form of particular kind and ending with the highest or sublime, most last species of form of that particular kind. Progressively we go from so-called crudest to the most high or most refined.
In short, in between the most first and most last species of form of a particular form, there are diverse and innumerable species of form of that particular form, evolved to suit the requirements of the evolving consciousness of the soul.
So, from the first to the last, there are so many diverse forms to suit that particular consciousness of the soul to reach to the last of that particular form, and then it jumps to another form. Baba had somebody, this is not a part of God Speaks, I think it is given in beams, which is more or less a corollary to God Speaks, where somebody asked, okay, what about so many species now which are extinct, dinosaurs and so many, there may be so many, which are now extinct. So how is it that the consciousness will get the experience of those species? Then Baba, my interpretation is that Baba says that irrespective of as many species which have now become extinct, the consciousness of the soul will get, there is a linkage, so that they will get the experience even though not of, there is no cut. Just because the species is cut, extinct, doesn't mean that there will be no progress in the evolution of consciousness. It will find its way out and move on further.
Coming to the point, when the consciousness of the soul associates itself with the most last species of vegetable form, The conscious soul identifies itself with this most last species of vegetable form and experiences the impressions of the most last but one species of the vegetable form that was last shed.
Again, the same mechanics is there, that the most last species of the vegetable form will experience the most last but one species, the impressions of the most last but one species. Baba is repeating the same thing. The most, I am also repeating so that it sinks in our system. The most last species of the vegetable form is nothing but made out of the consolidated mold of the most last but one before, last but one species of the vegetable form. Now that form has dropped, the impressions are there, these impressions get into a mold and give you what is called the most last species of the vegetable form. The most last species of the vegetable form will now experience and exhaust in that most last species of the vegetable form the impressions which were gathered in the last but one species of the vegetable form. And once all those impressions are experienced, the most last species of the vegetable form will be dropped. It with the consciousness will dissociate itself with the most last species of the vegetable form, and automatically, for the time being, the consciousness now is focused on the impressions which have been gathered or accumulated in or by the most last species of the vegetable form for some time, because now it is without the form. And immediately now it will jump to the next, which is what we call as reptiles or insects. We'll come to that.
By association with the medium of the most next species of vegetable form, the consciousness of the soul experiences in the gross world the impressions of that last species of vegetable form just dropped. When these impressions are exhausted through diverse experiences, the consciousness of the soul relinquishes its association with the most next species of vegetable form and again experiences that it, the soul, is without gross form and that its consciousness is centered only in the impressions of that species of form last dropped. Again, to experience these...
I'm not getting this. Where are you reading from? No, I've got something. As I said, there has been some changes. Never mind. So I'll read what is the current second edition. Coming to the point, when the consciousness of the soul associates itself with the most last species of vegetable form, the conscious soul identifies itself with this most last species of vegetable form and experiences the impressions of the most last but one species of the vegetable form that was last shed. We know all this mechanics by now. When all the impressions of this most last but one species of vegetable form are exhausted, the conscious soul no longer identifies itself with the most last species of vegetable form because the consciousness of the soul has dissociated itself from the most last species of the vegetable form. This most last species of vegetable form is also eventually shed by the conscious soul after ages and cycles of experience of the whole vegetable kingdom through the gross world on earth and in the waters. So after all the experiences, it is shedding. Although the most last species of vegetable form is shed by the conscious soul, and the soul is now without any form, yet the consciousness evolved is there. And through this consciousness, the soul, though without form, is conscious of the impressions of the most last species of the vegetable form just shed. I think it's very simple to understand. these impressions must necessarily be spent or exhausted. Is there in order, are you having that? No, okay. In order to experience these impressions, what page are you on?
60.
I'm in 18. Anyway, in order to experience these impressions, the consciousness of the soul now associates with an appropriate medium to experience these impressions of the most last species of the vegetable form. We'll stop now because there's hardly any time. Therefore, the consciousness of the soul thus tends the soul to identify itself with the most first species of the worm form. So now all the vegetables over, and now we are coming to the worm form. So what is the, just imagine the freedom and the joy of the worm to be able to crawl and to be able to move about and to be able to fly and all that, which could not be done by that consciousness of the soul in the vegetable form. We have seen from a recumbent position, as in stone and metal, now we have got a standing position, a horizontal position in the vegetable form. We have seen that inanimate things now partly animate, partly inanimate. In the worm form, there is a huge change where totally animate, alive. I know that I am alive. I know I can move, I can run about, and I have a sense of, a protection. I want to protect myself. Somebody is trying to hit me, and I am running away from this. So this is the most first species of the worm form. It must be remembered, again the same thing.
I got it.
Go ahead.
It must be remembered that this form of the most first species of worm form is nothing other than the consolidated mold of the impressions of the most last species of the vegetable
Correct.
form.
Now so easy, it's like a poem. First it is very difficult. Even tables, 4 ones are 4, 4 twos are 8, 4 is 12, 4 16. Once you do it, then it's like a poetry. It just flows naturally and automatically. I think we are almost done. There are 2 more minutes. I don't want to start a new. Now we are in the worm form, as and when the trustees and the Johan and the others give us the permission to use this, then we'll progress further from the worm to other forms. Till then, because I can understand they have a lot of work, they have to wrap up all these equipments for the Amar Tithi, so perhaps we might meet, I don't know, in the next month or whenever it is. And so we'll
20th?
progress, I don't know,
20th.
go ahead. But are we there?
Yes, we are there.
What is the date?
20th.
20.
Yes, we are there. Yes.
20th is Saturday.
Yes.
So we'll have it on Saturday. So we'll hope to
Yes.
move as fast as possible from the worm to some other form, if possible. Today we have moved from stone to metal, metals and minerals, and from metals to the vegetables, and even entered the worm form. Thank you very much. Thank you, beloved Baba. Avatar Meher Baba ki Jai. Jai Baba.